Every morning, Danielle Brooks showed up to Harper's Diner, poured coffee for people who barely looked at her, and carried a pain so heavy she had learned to make it invisible. She was just a waitress. That's what this town had decided. But on one quiet Thursday morning, a disabled Navy SEAL walked in on crutches, sat down in her section, and his military K-9 did something nobody could explain. The dog locked eyes on Danielle and refused to move. And what followed would unravel a secret buried for 20 years, one that someone was willing to kill to keep hidden. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. Harper's Diner sat on the edge of Route 9, like something the town had forgotten to tear down. The sign above the door had been missing 2 letters for almost a year, and the parking lot had more cracks in it than smooth pavement, but none of that stopped people from coming. Every morning, the same trucks pulled in before the sun was fully up. The same farmers took the corner booth. The same retired schoolteacher sat at the counter with her crossword puzzle and nursed a single cup of coffee for an hour and a half. Harper's Diner was the kind of place that wasn't much to look at, but felt like something real the moment you stepped inside. The smell helped. Coffee, bacon grease, and something sweet that was almost always biscuits. The floors were old linoleum that squeaked in 3 specific spots, and the lighting was warm in a way that made everybody look a little better than they probably felt. By 7 in the morning, every seat in the place was usually spoken for, and by 9, the breakfast rush had died down enough that the waitstaff could finally breathe. Danielle Brooks was wiping down the counter when the morning crowd started thinning out. She moved the rag in slow, practiced circles, her mind somewhere else entirely, while her body went through the motions she'd repeated so many times they no longer required thought. 28 years old, quick with a smile when a smile was called for, and precise in the way people become when they've been doing something long enough to stop wasting motion. She wore her hair pulled back, her uniform pressed, and she kept her section cleaner than anyone else's in the building. The regulars liked her. Most of them, anyway. Mr. Calloway always tipped $2 regardless of how long she worked the table. The Hendersons asked for her by name when they came in on Sundays. Old Earl at the end stool didn't say much to anybody, but always knocked twice on the counter when she refilled his coffee as a kind of silent thank you. Then there were the others. The ones who looked past her when they spoke, or talked to her like she was part of the furniture rather than the person keeping their breakfast from being a disaster. She learned a long time ago not to let it show, to keep the smile steady and the tone even, because the job paid her bills and she needed the bills paid. Simple as that. What the regulars didn't know, and what Danielle worked hard to keep hidden behind every polite good morning and careful coffee pour, was that she hadn't slept more than 4 hours in weeks. Her younger brother Marcus had been missing for almost 3 months. Not missing in the way people sometimes say it, when they mean someone moved without leaving a forwarding address. Missing in the way that meant she'd filed a police report, driven to 3 different cities looking for him, and spent her nights scrolling through social media pages and calling hospital intake desks with the kind of quiet desperation she couldn't afford to show at work. Marcus was 23 and had always been sharp, too curious for his own good, their grandmother used to say, always pulling at loose threads. About 6 months before he disappeared, he'd started asking questions about their family that Danielle hadn't known how to answer because she didn't have the answers herself. Questions about their parents, about the years before their grandmother took them in, about a stretch of time in both their childhoods that felt blurry in a way that had never quite made sense. Then he stopped calling. Then his apartment was empty. Then the police told her they had no leads. She transferred the worry into movement, into work, into the counter she wiped, and the coffee she poured, and the orders she took with a steady hand and a steady voice. Her grandmother, 71 years old and moving slower every month, was at home on the same fixed income she'd been on for years, and Danielle's paycheck was what kept the lights on and the refrigerator stocked. She didn't have the luxury of falling apart, so she didn't. The late morning crowd on that particular Thursday was the usual mix. A table of contractors taking up the big round booth in the back. 2 women from the real estate office who came in every Thursday and always split a piece of pie. A young couple with a stroller parked beside their table, and a look on both their faces that said they hadn't slept either, though for very different reasons than Danielle. She moved between them all without thinking, the tray balanced, the coffee hot, the checks delivered at exactly the right moment. She was coming back from the kitchen with a plate of scrambled eggs when the diner door opened and the bell above it gave its usual jangle. She didn't look up immediately. People came and went, and she'd stopped cataloging every entrance. But something made her glance over when she set the eggs down, some instinct she couldn't have named, and she saw him coming through the door. He was tall. Even with the crutches, it was obvious, the kind of height that meant he had to think about door frames. His face was mid-40s, weathered in a specific way. Not the weathering of sun and outdoor work, but of sustained stress and difficult years. Clean-shaved, dark hair going silver at the temples. He wore a jacket that looked military, olive green, with a subdued patch on one shoulder that she couldn't read from across the room. His right leg was the problem. There was something in the way he moved that said the injury was real and recent, and the crutches weren't something he was comfortable with yet. Beside him was the dog. Large German shepherd, deep black and tan, with a build that made him look less like a pet and more like a colleague. He wore a solid tactical harness in black nylon with a handle on top and a small metal tag Danielle couldn't read. He moved exactly how his handler moved, measured, controlled, alert without being edgy. His eyes tracked the room as they entered, not anxiously but methodically, the way a person checks their surroundings out of practice rather than fear. A few of the regulars looked up. One of the contractors said something low to the man beside him. Old Earl at the counter tracked the dog for a few seconds and then went back to his coffee. The young couple watched with mild interest. The veteran moved toward the available seating, and Danielle could see him working it out, which tables had chairs easy to navigate with crutches, where there was enough room to park the dog without blocking an aisle. Most of the diner was occupied. The choices were limited. He came toward her section. Danielle had just settled into a brief pause between tasks, a 2-minute window that happened maybe twice in a shift where she could stand still without something needing immediate attention. She was standing beside a small table near the window, the one she sometimes used to sort her checks when things slowed down. He stopped a few feet away and looked at the empty chair across from her. Then he looked at her. "Can I sit here?" he asked. His voice was quiet, direct, not unfriendly. The kind of voice that was used to being listened to, but wasn't performing anything. Danielle pulled the chair out before she'd consciously decided to. "Of course," she said. "You want coffee? Please." She grabbed a mug from the station behind her and brought the pot over, filling it without fuss. The dog settled on the floor beside the man's chair, perfectly still, head up, watching the room. Up close, the animal was even more impressive. The harness had a small patch that read K9 in bold lettering, and the dog's focus was complete, not distracted by the food smells or the noise or the people. Just present in the way that working dogs are. "He's beautiful," Danielle said because she meant it. "His name's Ranger," the man said. He wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. "I'm Nathan. Nathan Cole." "Danielle." She set the coffee pot down. "You need a minute with the menu, or do you know what you want?" "Just coffee for now. Maybe biscuits." She nodded and wrote it down, and that was where the ordinary part of the morning ended. She had turned back toward the kitchen when it happened. She'd taken maybe 4 steps, enough to be a few feet past their table, and she heard it, a low sound from the dog. Not a bark, not aggressive. A concentrated, focused growl that started deep in the chest and didn't rise, just held itself at a steady vibration. She turned around. Ranger was on his feet. He was staring directly at her. Not at the door. Not at the contractors in the back booth. Not at the couple with the stroller or the pie-splitting women from the real estate office. Directly at Danielle. His ears were fully forward. His weight shifted slightly to his front legs. His entire posture changed from relaxed alertness to something more intent. His tail was low and still. His eyes didn't move. "Ranger." Nathan's voice was low and firm. The dog didn't flinch. Danielle stopped walking. "I'm sorry, is he okay?" "He's fine," Nathan said, but the way he said it made clear that he wasn't entirely sure what was happening. He leaned forward slightly in his chair, watching the dog with an expression she couldn't read. "Ranger." "Down." Ranger didn't move. Danielle heard one of the contractors say something. She heard the women from the real estate office go quiet mid-sentence. The diner had a way of absorbing small dramas, spilled coffee, a child's tantrum, an argument between regulars. But this was different. The stillness of the dog was strange in a way that made the whole room pay attention. People weren't looking away. Someone near the window had their phone out. "I haven't done anything," Danielle said, and she heard how defensive it sounded and hated herself for it. "I don't know why he's—" "It's not that," Nathan said. His voice was careful now, measured like he was processing something quickly. "He doesn't react this way because of a threat. This is different." "Different how?" Nathan didn't answer immediately. He was watching Ranger, and there was something in his face, a recognition, maybe, or the beginning of one. Like a man who has opened a door he expected to find locked. The phone that someone had pulled out wasn't the only one anymore. Danielle counted 3 from where she stood, all pointed at the dog who continued staring at her like she was the only thing in the room. She became aware of her own breathing, aware of the way her hands had gone very still at her sides, aware that 15 people in a roadside diner were watching her with the same focused attention as a trained military canine. She wanted to tell them all to put their phones down. She wanted to explain that she was just a waitress and she had biscuits in the oven and none of this was what it looked like. But she didn't know what it looked like, and that was the problem. "Ranger," Nathan said again. Firm, quiet, the tone of a man who expected to be obeyed. The dog moved, not away from Danielle. He padded forward 3 steps and sat down beside her feet, pressing himself gently against her left leg like a dog returning to someone familiar. Like he had found what he was looking for and was settling in. The diner made a collective sound. Not loud, more like a held breath releasing, a murmur of confusion and surprise. Nathan stared. Danielle looked down at the dog beside her, then back at Nathan, then back at the dog. She didn't reach down to touch him. She wasn't sure she should. "I don't understand what just happened," she said. "Neither do I," Nathan said, which Danielle could tell was not something he said often or easily. He was a man who liked to understand things, and whatever had just happened was sitting outside that. "Come here, Ranger." Ranger looked at Nathan. Then he looked back up at Danielle. He didn't move. Danielle exhaled slowly. Do you want me to step away from him?" "No," Nathan said. He picked up his coffee mug, set it down again without drinking. "Can you sit down for a second?" She looked toward the kitchen. The biscuits were still a few minutes out, and her other tables were settled. She pulled a chair out and sat across from him, the dog still pressed against her leg like he'd chosen a side. Nathan watched all of this with the steady attention of a man reading a situation. Up close, his eyes were dark brown, and despite the fatigue in his face, there was something sharp and precise in the way he looked at things. He'd been trained to observe, and she could feel it. "I need to explain something about him," Nathan said. "Ranger is not a companion animal. He's a working military canine. He served 8 years in active deployment. He's trained in explosive detection, personnel tracking, and threat assessment. In combat, he never made a wrong call. Not once." He paused. "When Ranger reacts to someone, it means something. The way he reacted to you, sitting at your side like that, that's not a behavior I've seen directed at a civilian. Ever." Danielle kept her expression even. "What does it mean when he does that?" "In the field, it means he's identified someone connected to a military operation. A handler, a trainee, or someone exposed to specific protocols." Nathan set both forearms on the table. "He recognized something in you. A scent, a posture, something. I don't know what yet. I've never been near a military base," Danielle said. "I grew up here. I've worked in this diner and a grocery store 2 towns over, and that's basically my whole resume." "I believe you," Nathan said, and he sounded like he did. "But Ranger doesn't make things up." She looked down at the dog. He was still watching her with those calm, gold-brown eyes. She'd been around dogs before. Plenty of people brought dogs into the diner lot, left them in trucks during breakfast, but she'd never had one look at her quite like this. Not evaluating, not unsure, like he already knew something that she didn't. She reached down, almost without thinking, and made a small motion with her left hand. 3 fingers extended, palm down, a small downward flick of the wrist. Ranger went instantly flat on the floor. not lying down the way a relaxed dog lies down. The precise, flat position of a trained animal responding to a command. The room went quiet again. Nathan's coffee mug stopped halfway to his mouth. Danielle stared at her own hand. She didn't know where that had come from. The gesture had arrived, fully formed from somewhere she couldn't locate, natural as lifting a coffee pot, and she had performed it without thinking. "Where did you learn that?" Nathan said. His voice had changed. Not alarmed, not aggressive. Carefully, precisely controlled in the way that meant something had shifted inside the conversation. "I don't know," Danielle said, and she meant it completely. "I don't know where that came from. I didn't think about it. It just—" She stopped. "What did I just do?" "That's a military K-9 handler's command. Downstay with sustained attention hold. It's used in field operations when a handler needs the dog absolutely still without verbal reinforcement." Nathan was watching her with the same focus Ranger had been using. "That command is not public knowledge. It's not in any civilian training manual. It's not something you pick up from a YouTube video or a dog training class." Danielle felt something strange move through her. Not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it. A kind of vertigo, like the ground had shifted a half-inch in a direction she hadn't anticipated. "I've never been trained with military dogs." "Not that you remember," Nathan said quietly. She looked up at him. "What does that mean?" He didn't answer immediately. He was thinking. She could see him assembling something, pieces being placed carefully. "Tell me about your childhood," he said, "before you came to live with your grandmother." It was an odd question from a stranger in a diner, and under any other circumstances, she would have given a polite non-answer and gone back to work. But Ranger was lying flat on the floor at her feet, responding to a command she hadn't known she knew, and 15 people in the diner had just filmed her doing it, and the ground still felt slightly tilted. "I don't remember much," she said. "My parents died when I was young. I was maybe 7 or 8. My grandmother took us in after that, me and Marcus. She never talked much about what happened before, and I never pushed it. Some things you learn not to ask about." "Do you remember anything from before the move? Where you lived? What your parents did?" She shook her head slowly. "It's all kind of blurry, like trying to remember a dream. I have images sometimes. Big rooms, lots of people, but nothing I could tell you was definitely real." Nathan nodded like this confirmed something rather than surprised him. He opened his mouth to say something else. That was when Ranger stood up, not lazily, not gradually, up in a single motion, body oriented toward the front window of the diner. His ears were forward, his posture tight. A different alert from the one he'd shown toward Danielle. This one had an edge to it. Nathan turned his head without moving the rest of his body, an old reflex, and looked toward the window. Outside, across the two-lane road that ran past Harper's Diner, a black SUV sat in the gas station lot. Not parked at a pump, just parked, facing the diner. The windows were tinted dark enough that Danielle couldn't see the occupants. "Has that car been there long?" Nathan asked. "I don't know," she said. "I didn't notice it before." Danielle thought back through the morning and realized she had noticed the car. It had been there when she'd stepped outside briefly to help a regular carry something to his truck, maybe 40 minutes ago. At the time, she'd registered it as nothing. She wasn't sure it was nothing now. Ranger remained at the window position, not growling, just watching with the specific attention of an animal that had been trained to recognize things that weren't supposed to be there. "His name is Victor Hale," said a voice from across the diner. Both Danielle and Nathan turned. The contractor near the back booth was standing, except he wasn't a contractor. Danielle registered this suddenly, the wrongness of it, in the way you recognize a detail you'd filed incorrectly. He'd come in alone, no tools, no work boots. Just a man eating breakfast quietly in the back of the diner. And she'd assumed he was a contractor because that's who sat in that booth, and she hadn't thought twice about it. He was already walking toward the door. He had his phone pressed to his ear, speaking quietly, and he pushed through the glass door and out into the parking lot before Nathan could say anything. Nathan watched him go. His jaw was set. "Who's Victor Hale?" Danielle asked. "I don't know yet," Nathan said. "But that man knew the name before I did." Outside, the man from the back booth got into a dark sedan parked along the side of the building, the part of the lot Danielle couldn't see from her usual station. He pulled out quickly, driving in the direction opposite the gas station, and within 30 seconds he was gone. Nathan turned back to Danielle. His voice was low but clear. I want you to listen to me carefully. I don't want to alarm you, but I need you to know that whatever Ranger recognized in you, it means something to someone else as well. That car sitting across the street, and the man making a phone call as he walks out. Those things together don't read as coincidence. Danielle felt the calm she'd been maintaining start to develop cracks. She'd been in difficult situations before, the kind that came with being a young black woman navigating certain spaces. But this was a different category of difficult. This had a specific, focused quality that made her stomach drop. You think someone was watching me, she said. I think Ranger noticed you, and someone else noticed Ranger noticing you. Nathan looked back toward the window. The black SUV hadn't moved. There's a pattern here I recognize. In the field, you learn to tell the difference between random and deliberate. That, he gestured subtly toward the SUV, is deliberate. Danielle kept her voice steady. What do you think they want? I don't know yet, but I need to ask you something that might seem strange. He looked at her directly. Think carefully. When I ask you about your life before age 10, the parts that feel blurry, do they feel blurry the way ordinary forgotten memories feel blurry? Or does it feel like something that was put behind a wall? She thought about it honestly. She'd always told herself she had a poor memory for childhood, that the trauma of losing her parents had fogged those early years. Most people accepted that explanation because it made sense. But there had always been something underneath it, a sense not of forgetting, but of something being unreachable in a very specific way, like a word that stays just out of reach no matter how long you try to pull it forward. The second one, she said quietly. Nathan nodded. He looked at Ranger, then back at her. I think you may be connected to something you have no conscious memory of. And I think the people in that car already know it. Danielle looked down at Ranger, who had returned from his position at the window and was now sitting calmly at her feet again. She thought about Marcus, about the questions he'd started asking before he disappeared, about the way he described it once in the last real conversation they'd had. It's like there's a whole chapter of our lives that someone tore out. She thought about the gesture her hand had made without her permission. What do I do? She asked. Nathan looked toward the window one more time. The black SUV was still there. Then, very calmly, it pulled out of the gas station lot, turned onto the road, and drove away in the same direction as the sedan that had left minutes before. The moment passed. The diner noise filled back in. Forks on plates, low conversations, the coffee maker running through a cycle. Old Earl knocked twice on the counter for a refill, and Danielle went to get the pot, because that was her job, and she needed to keep doing her job. But as she poured the coffee, her hand was not entirely steady. Nathan watched her from the table. Ranger watched her too, with those gold-brown eyes that seemed to hold more certainty than any of the humans in the room. Whatever those two vehicles had been, whatever that man in the back booth had said in his phone, one thing had already shifted and couldn't be shifted back. Someone knew that Danielle Brooks had made a military K-9 command gesture in a roadside diner, and that knowledge was now moving through the world in a way she had no control over. And Nathan Cole, a Navy SEAL who'd spent 2 decades trusting his dog's instincts over almost everything else, had no intention of walking away from it. He picked up his coffee cup, looked at Danielle when she came back to refill it, and said, I think I like those biscuits after all. And then I think we need to talk. The lunch rush arrived like it always did, filling every seat and keeping Danielle moving without pause for nearly 2 hours. Nathan stayed at his table through all of it. He ordered the biscuits, then a plate of eggs, and Ranger lay quietly at his feet like he belonged there, which made the other customers curious but not alarmed once they saw the service harness. A working dog in a diner wasn't something people encountered every day, but it wasn't something to argue about either. And after the strange scene of the morning, most of the regulars had decided Nathan Cole was someone worth leaving alone. Danielle worked her section with the same steady efficiency she always did. She smiled where smiles were appropriate, refilled coffee before anyone had to ask, kept her orders clean and her timing precise. But a part of her mind was somewhere else entirely. Every time she passed Nathan's table, she felt Ranger's attention track her, and that feeling of being recognized by something that didn't make mistakes sat in her chest and wouldn't settle. When the lunch crowd cleared and the diner dropped into its quieter mid-afternoon rhythm, she refilled Nathan's coffee one more time and sat down across from him. "You're still here," she said. "Ranger won't leave," he said simply, "and I don't go where he won't." She looked at the dog. He had his head resting on his front paws, but his eyes were open and tracking. "You really trust him that much?" "He kept me alive in 3 different countries," Nathan said. "I trust him more than most people." He wrapped both hands around the mug. "How are you doing?" It was a direct question, which she appreciated. "I'm keeping it together," she said. "I'm good at that." "I noticed." She folded her hands on the table. "Tell me what you think is happening. Not the careful version, the real one." Nathan considered this for a moment. He didn't seem like a man who spoke carelessly, and she got the impression he was deciding how much of the actual shape of the thing to show her. Then he seemed to decide she'd earned the straight version. "There were programs," he said, "during certain periods of military operations, going back 20, 25 years. Most of them were standard. Intelligence, logistics, communications. But there were a handful that operated outside the normal structure, things that the official record doesn't reflect clearly. A few of them involve families. People inside the military community, contractors, civilian personnel with high clearance. Their children, in some cases." Danielle kept her expression steady. "Children." The idea was coordination, not combat, nothing like that. These were children of people already deep inside classified work. The thinking was that if standard communication systems failed during a high-stakes operation, having personnel at multiple levels who could receive and relay information using nonverbal protocols, including K9 signal systems, created a kind of backup network. Completely undetectable. Nothing written down. Nothing transmitted electronically. He paused. The children involved were young enough that the training integrated naturally. They learned it the way kids learn language, without knowing they were learning anything at all. Danielle was quiet for a moment. "You're telling me I was part of something like that?" "I'm telling you Ranger thinks so. And I'm telling you that the gesture you made this morning is not something you invented." He leaned forward slightly. "That command is specific to a single training facility. I know because Ranger was trained there. There's a very small number of people in the world who know that signal, and every single one of them has a documented connection to classified operations." Outside the diner window, a pickup truck pulled into the lot, and an older man went inside the gas station across the road. Normal. Ordinary. Danielle watched it anyway. "My parents," she said. "Tell me about them." "I don't know much. My grandmother doesn't talk about them. When I was little, I used to ask, and she'd get this look. Not sad exactly, more like scared. And after a while, I stopped asking." She paused. "I know they died in an accident. That's what I was told. I've never found a death certificate, never found any newspaper record of whatever the accident was. I told myself it was because I wasn't looking in the right places. But Marcus started looking about a year ago. He got deep into it, public records, military databases, anything he could find. About 6 months in, he told me he thought there was something wrong with the official story. A month after that, he was gone." Nathan listened to all of this without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and she could see him integrating it, placing it alongside whatever framework he was building. "The facility where Ranger was trained," he said finally. "It was connected to a program that ran through the late 90s and into the early 2000s. The program had several components. The one that involved civilian families, including children, was called something internally, but outside the facility, people who knew about it just called it the Anchor program. The idea was exactly what I described. Human memory as a secure channel." Danielle let the word settle. Anchor. It meant nothing consciously. But somewhere below the level of recognition, something about the word made her feel slightly unsteady in a way she couldn't explain. "Why was it shut down?" she asked. "There was an incident. I don't have full details. This is rumor and fragment, not documented record. But something happened at the facility that compromised the program. After that, the official position was that it never existed. The children involved were relocated. Their families were told to treat the whole period as if it hadn't happened. Some of them complied. Some didn't. And the ones who didn't, Nathan looked at her steadily. That's the question, isn't it? Ranger lifted his head from his paws and looked toward the back of the diner. Not the front door, the back. He didn't growl, didn't stand, but the quality of his attention shifted. Danielle turned in her chair. The back hallway led to the restrooms and the emergency exit. There was nobody visible. After a few seconds, Ranger put his head back down. He does that sometimes, Nathan said, watching the hallway. Checking. He's been in too many places where the danger came from the direction you weren't looking. Danielle turned back. What happened to my parents? I don't know, Nathan said. But I think finding Marcus might get us closer to that answer. The name landed between them. She'd been keeping Marcus at a distance all morning, the way she kept him at a distance every day, because looking directly at his absence was something she couldn't do and still function. Now Nathan had said his name in the same sentence as the program and the facility and the children who hadn't been allowed to remember, and the distance collapsed. You think he found something real, she said. I think he found something real, and the wrong people found out about it. Nathan set down his mug. I need to ask you something difficult. When you try to remember your early childhood, before your grandmother, before the move, are there specific images? Not full memories, just images. She hadn't talked about this to anyone. Not her grandmother, not a therapist, not Marcus even. It had always seemed like the kind of thing better left alone, a quirk of her particular psychology rather than something meaningful. Large rooms, she said. Clean. Concrete floors like a gym but emptier. Dogs, big ones like Ranger. And people who weren't unfriendly but weren't warm either. Like teachers who took the job seriously but weren't there to be liked. Nathan's expression didn't change dramatically, but something in it settled. Those aren't dreams. I know, she said quietly. I think I've always known. The afternoon light through the diner windows was going gold and thin. The cook was starting prep for the dinner menu in the kitchen, and the smell of something roasting moved through the room. Danielle looked at Ranger, who was watching her again now, steadily, without performance. Like a guardian who had found the person they'd been assigned to, and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. What do we do? She asked. Tonight, Nathan said. I'd like to come by your house. Talk to your grandmother. Danielle hesitated. Her grandmother was 71 and moved carefully and had spent decades building a life inside a specific silence. The idea of bringing this, whatever this was, into her house felt like picking up a stone and not knowing what was underneath it. But Marcus was missing, and her hands had made a gesture she hadn't learned. And a dog trained in 3 combat zones had walked across a diner and sat down at her feet like he was coming home. 8 o'clock, she said. She goes to bed at 9, so come before that. Nathan nodded. Ranger and I will be there. She stood up, straightened her apron, and went back to work. But her mind was already somewhere else, somewhere past the counter and the coffee and the dinner rush, running ahead to whatever was sitting in the space her grandmother had kept sealed shut for 20 years. The house Danielle shared with her grandmother was a small 2-bedroom on a quiet street 3 blocks from the edge of town. It wasn't much to look at from the outside. Pale yellow siding, a front porch with 2 chairs nobody sat in much, a garden along the right side that her grandmother kept up with a stubborn commitment of someone who needed to watch things grow. Inside it was clean and warm and full of the specific density of a life lived in one place for a long time. Photographs on the walls, crocheted blankets on the chairs, a kitchen that smelled like whatever her grandmother had made for dinner. Danielle had called ahead. She hadn't explained everything. She hadn't known how. But she'd said there was someone who needed to speak with them both, and that it was important, and her grandmother had been quiet on the phone for a moment in a way that told Danielle she already knew, in a way people sometimes know when a thing they've been waiting for finally shows up at the door. Nathan arrived at 5 minutes to 8. He'd changed out of the olive jacket into a plain dark shirt, crutches tucked under both arms, Ranger walking at his left side. Danielle met them on the porch and led them inside. Her grandmother, Rose Brooks, was sitting in the armchair she always sat in after dinner, a cup of tea on the side table and her hands folded in her lap. She was a small woman, slight in the way of people who had always been economical rather than fragile, with white hair pulled back and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She watched Nathan come through the door with the expression of a person preparing to tell the truth they'd been holding on to for a very long time. "Mrs. Brooks," Nathan said. "My name is Nathan Cole. I'm a retired Navy SEAL. Thank you for letting me come." Rose looked at Ranger. The dog had come through the door and was now standing in the center of the living room, calm and attentive. Rose looked at him for a long time without saying anything. Then she said, "That dog is from a facility." Danielle went still. Nathan said, "Yes, ma'am." He was. Rose unfolded her hands and picked up her tea. Her hands were steady. "I always thought it would be a dog," she said. "I used to think that. Not a government car, not a phone call. A dog." She looked at Danielle. "Come sit down, baby." Danielle sat on the couch. Nathan took the chair near the window, Ranger settling at his feet, but facing Rose with attention that clearly registered with the old woman. "Danielle's parents," Nathan began. "Thomas and Yvette," Rose said. "My son and his wife." Her voice was even, like she was reciting something she had said to herself many times and learned to say without breaking. Thomas worked for the Department of Defense. Not a soldier, a contractor, logistics and systems. Yvette had a background in behavioral psychology. That's how they ended up in the program. "The Anchor program," Nathan said. Rose nodded slowly. "That's what they called it. Thomas explained it to me once when things started feeling wrong. The idea was that children with the right developmental profile could learn certain communication protocols the way they learn language, without strain, without formal instruction. Those protocols were tied to the K-9 units already operating in the field. The children became part of the information network. Living encryption, Thomas called it." She paused. He thought it was remarkable. He thought they were doing something important. When did he stop thinking that? Nathan asked. "About 6 months before he died." Rose set her tea down. He started noticing things. Inconsistencies in how the program was being run. Resources moving in directions they shouldn't have been. He brought it to his supervisor, and nothing happened. He brought it to someone above that, and was told to drop it. She looked at Nathan steadily. Thomas was not a man who dropped things. "What did he find?" Nathan asked. "I don't have all of it. He kept details away from me to protect me. And in hindsight, I think he kept some from Yvette too. But the part one know is that money was being moved through the program. Large amounts, connected to contracts that didn't reflect real work. Phantom logistics, equipment that was billed for but never existed. And underneath that, things worse than money. Decisions that got people killed so the evidence trail could be shortened." Rose's voice stayed even throughout this, but Danielle could see the effort behind it. He was going to go public. He and Yvette both. They'd gathered documentation. The room was quiet for a moment. Ranger had not moved. "The accident," Danielle said. "No accident," Rose said, and her voice broke slightly on the word, the first crack in the composure. Just slightly. "The car went off the road on a clear night on a road Thomas had driven 100 times. I knew it wasn't an accident. I knew it the minute the officer told me." She breathed. "But I had 2 young children to raise and no power to prove anything, and the message was clear. So I took you both, and I came here, and I built the smallest, quietest life I could, and I prayed it would be enough." Danielle felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for as long as she could remember. Not released exactly. The grief was too old and too layered for that, but acknowledged. Named. The blurry years, the careful silence. Her grandmother's practiced flinch whenever their parents came up. It hadn't been forgetting. It had been surviving. The memory suppression, Nathan said gently. "The children who went through the program, was there a formal process?" "A therapist came. 3 visits, spread out over a few months. I was told it was trauma counseling, and maybe some of it was, but looking back, the sessions were very focused on specific periods. Very specific." Rose looked at Danielle. "I didn't fully understand what they were doing at the time. By the time I did, it seemed better not to pull at it." "You were protecting her," Nathan said. "I was scared," Rose said simply, "which amounts to the same thing, and I've had 20 years to feel sorry about it." Danielle reached across and put her hand over her grandmother's. Rose turned her hand over and held it. "Marcus," Danielle said. "He started asking questions about a year ago. Did he come to you?" Rose was quiet for a moment. He came to me about 8 months ago. He found something, I don't know how, through public records or some database. I don't fully understand how he does these things. He found a reference to the facility, a building permit under a contractor name that linked to the program. He asked me directly if I knew anything. She paused. I told him some of it. Not everything. Enough that he knew the questions were real. And then he started digging further, Danielle said. I told him to stop, Rose said. I told him the same people were still out there and still capable of what they'd done before. He said he understood. She looked at the window. He stopped calling 2 months later. Nathan had been quiet for a few minutes, thinking. Now he leaned forward. Mrs. Brooks, was there anything in the house? Anything Thomas or Yvette left behind? Documentation they might have given you for safekeeping? Anything physical from that period that you've held on to? Rose didn't answer immediately. There was a long pause, the kind that meant the answer was yes, and the question was whether to say it. There's a storage box, she said finally. In the attic. I've never opened it. Thomas gave it to me 2 weeks before he died and told me not to open it unless something happened to him. And then something happened to him, and I was so frightened She stopped. I put it up there, and I've been walking past it for 20 years. Danielle stood up before anyone said anything else. I'll get it. The attic was accessed through a hatch in the ceiling of the hallway, pulled down stairs that Danielle had maybe used twice in her life. She pulled the cord and the stairs came down stiff with disuse, and she climbed them into the dark. A pull chain light came on, throwing yellow light over everything her grandmother had stored up here over 20 years of quiet life. She found a box near the back, behind a stack of old magazines and a broken floor lamp. It was a metal box, the kind you could find in any hardware store, dark green with a latch but no lock. She carried it down carefully, set on a coffee table. They all looked at it for a moment. Then Danielle opened it. Inside, wrapped in a cloth to protect them, were photographs. She lifted them out carefully. The top one stopped her completely. A young girl, maybe 6 or 7, in a clean concrete room much like the ones in Danielle's fragmented memories. She was kneeling beside a large German shepherd, her hand raised in a gesture, the same gesture Danielle had made that morning in the diner. The same precise position of the fingers, the same angle of the wrist. The girl was looking at the camera with the serious expression of a child who has been asked to perform a task and is concentrating on doing it right. The girl was Danielle. She set the photograph down and looked at the next one. Her father, Thomas Young, in a light-colored shirt, standing in front of a building she didn't recognize. Behind him, visible through an open door, were rows of kennels. On the building's facade, barely visible at the edge of the photo, was a logo. Nathan leaned over and went still when he saw it. You know it, Danielle said. I know it, Nathan said. That facility was attached to a joint intelligence operation that ran until about 2003. The contractor that ran it, he stopped. He was looking at the photograph with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not surprise. Something colder and more focused. The contractor was called Hale Defense Systems, named for the man who ran it. Danielle looked at him. Victor Hale. Victor Hale, Nathan said. The name sat in the room for a moment. Concrete now in a way it hadn't been before. Not just a stranger seen leaving a diner. Not just a name dropped by a man making a suspicious phone call. A name attached to a facility, a program, a young girl in a photograph, and 2 people who tried to expose what was happening and had ended up dead on a clear night on a familiar road. Ranger stood up. He was facing the front of the house. Not the window, the door. His ears were fully forward, his posture locked into the alert position. And this was different from the alertness he'd shown toward Danielle. This was the alert of a dog who had been in enough dangerous places to know when something was approaching that shouldn't be. Nathan was on his feet before Danielle fully processed what was happening. He moved with surprising speed for a man on crutches, reaching the window beside the door and looking out at an angle without standing in front of the glass. Danielle came to stand behind him and looked out. 2 sets of headlights sat in the street in front of the house, engines running. They hadn't been there 5 minutes ago. Neither car had pulled into a driveway or moved on. They were simply stopped in the dark, facing the house. Then the street light at the end of the block went out. Then the one in front of the house. And then the power to the house went out entirely, dropping every light and the hum of the refrigerator and the glow of the digital clock on the microwave into complete darkness. From the armchair, Rose made a small sound that was not quite a word. From outside, Danielle heard a car door open. "Get down," Nathan said quietly, and his voice had changed completely. The careful thoughtfulness of the diner was gone. What was left was something older and more exact, the voice of a man who has been in the dark before and knows what to do there. Danielle moved to her grandmother, took her hand, and brought her low. Ranger was at the door, silent now, every muscle in his body taut and ready. Nathan positioned himself to the side of the front window, and in the darkness Danielle could just see the silhouette of two figures moving carefully across the front yard toward the porch stairs. The evening that had begun with an old woman's long-held truth had become something else entirely. Someone had decided that the truth had been loose in the world long enough. The electricity died without warning. 1 second, the kitchen light was spilling through the pass-through window, and the lamp on the side table was casting its warm circle across the living room floor. And the next second, everything went dark and flat, and the only light in the house came from the street lamp 2 doors down, pressing thin orange lines through the blinds. Danielle's grandmother made a small, startled sound from her chair in the corner. Nathan was already moving. He didn't reach for a light switch or pull out his phone. He was off the couch in one motion, crutches abandoned, moving low and quiet toward the wall beside the front window. The injured leg slowed him but didn't stop him, and Danielle saw the transformation happen in real time. The man who'd been sitting across her kitchen table asking careful questions about her childhood disappeared, and someone else came forward in his place. Someone trained for rooms going dark. "Grandmother," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need you to get down and move behind the couch. Stay there and don't stand up." The old woman, to her credit, didn't argue or ask questions. She moved. "Danielle." Nathan's eyes found her in the dark. "Behind me." Ranger had positioned himself near the front door without being told. He was low, completely silent, the black of his coat making him almost invisible in the dim room. His ears were forward, and his attention was entirely on the door. Not anxious, not frantic, just locked in with the settled focus of an animal that had done this before and knew exactly what it meant. Danielle pressed herself against the wall beside Nathan. Her heart was slamming. She could see 2 shapes through the narrow gap at the edge of the blinds, dark silhouettes, moving with the particular deliberateness of people who expected the door to open for them. 2 of them, Nathan said quietly. "Front approach. There may be more around the back." "What do we do?" "We let Ranger do his job." The knock on the door never came. The first man simply tried the knob, found it locked, and then stepped back and raised his foot. The door came in hard, frames splintering, the hinges taking the worst of it. The man's flashlight swept the room in a tight arc, catching furniture and walls and the back of the couch where Danielle's grandmother was crouched and hidden. Ranger hit him before the light could complete its sweep. There was no warning sound, no build-up. One moment the dog was beside the wall, and the next he was across the room, and the man went down with a sound that was half shout and half grunt, the flashlight spinning away across the floor. Ranger didn't bark. He worked in focus silence, the way he'd been trained, and within seconds the first man was on the ground and not getting up quickly. The second man was already through the door. He was faster than his partner, better prepared. He'd anticipated the dog and had his weapon up. The shot he fired went wide, hitting the lamp on the side table, which exploded in a spray of ceramic and darkness. Danielle heard her grandmother make a sharp sound, but not a pain sound. She was still behind the couch. Nathan crossed the distance faster than a man with one working leg had any right to. He had the crutch reversed in his grip, the padded end in his hand, and he swung the metal base of it in a tight arc that connected with the second man's wrist before he could get the aim corrected. The gun went sideways. The man lunged for it, and Nathan stepped into him, driving an elbow into the center of his chest with the kind of force that comes from years of training and present-tense adrenaline. The second man hit the doorframe and stumbled back out onto the porch. Across the street, a porch light came on. Then another. Someone 2 houses down had heard the shot. Someone else must have been on the phone already, because in the distance, Faint but real, there was the sound of the siren starting up. The second man pulled the first man upright, and they moved fast across the yard, cutting through the neighbor's hedge and disappearing into the dark between houses. A car engine started somewhere down the block. Then silence. Nathan stood at the broken door, breathing hard, and listened. Ranger came and stood beside him, ears still forward, monitoring. After 30 seconds, Nathan's posture shifted, just slightly, the way tension releases when the immediate danger has passed. "They're gone," he said. Danielle let out a breath she'd been holding so long her ribs ached. She crossed to her grandmother and pulled her up from behind the couch, wrapping both arms around the older woman, who was shaking but upright and unhurt. "I'm all right," her grandmother said. "I'm all right, baby." Nathan had moved to the center of the room and was crouched over something the first man had dropped when Ranger took him down. He picked it up carefully, a small black device, rectangular, the size of a deck of cards. He turned it over once in his hands. "What is that?" Danielle asked. "Encrypted radio transmitter." He set it on the table, studying it without touching the surface contacts. "Private military contractor issue. Not law enforcement, not standard military. This is proprietary hardware from a very specific tier of private operation." He looked up at her. "Victor Hale has money behind him. Real money." The siren was getting closer. Nathan looked at the broken door, at the overturned furniture, at the lamp pieces scattered across the floor. "When the police get here, you tell them exactly what happened. Break in, 2 men, they fled. That's all you know." He looked at her steadily. "Don't mention any of the rest yet. Not until we understand what we're dealing with." Danielle nodded. She was still holding her grandmother's hand. She was thinking about the shot that had hit the lamp and wondering how different the angle would have needed to be. She was also thinking about something else entirely, something that had been moving at the edge of her mind since the moment the door came down, getting clearer as the adrenaline continued to course through her. Images she couldn't place. The sound of voice she couldn't identify. A room that was large and cold and smelled like industrial cleaner, and something else, like the inside of a car after a long drive, or the air near heavy equipment. Children sitting in a circle on a hard floor. She pressed her fingertips to her forehead. "Nathan," she said. He was near the window, watching the street for the police. "Yeah, I'm starting to remember something." He turned. It came in fragments, not a single coherent image, but pieces that didn't yet assemble into a complete picture, though each piece felt absolutely, unmistakably real. Not a dream, not imagination, the kind of specific sensory detail that only comes from lived experience. She had been in a large room with other children. She didn't know how many, more than 5, less than 20. They sat in rows on a hard floor, and an instructor walked between them, pausing at each child, saying something quietly that the other children couldn't hear. When the instructor reached Danielle, he had leaned down and said something she still couldn't recover, and she had repeated it back, and then she had made a gesture with her hand, the same gesture she'd made at the diner. Nathan was watching her carefully. He had the look of a man holding himself very still because he knew something important was happening and didn't want to disrupt it. "There were dogs," she said slowly. "Big ones. Like Ranger. They weren't scary. Nobody was afraid of them. We were being taught how to work with them." She paused. "I was good at it. Do you remember where this was?" She shook her head. "I just remember the room. And the dogs. And that it felt important, like what we were doing mattered." She dropped her hand from her forehead. "And I remember thinking it was exciting. I was a child, and I thought it was exciting." Nathan sat down in the nearest chair. The siren outside was close now, 2 minutes, maybe less. He had a very specific look on his face, the look of a man who has followed a thread through a very dark space and arrived somewhere he didn't expect to find. "There was a program," he said. "I heard about it years ago in the context of something else, a classified briefing that touched the edges of it without ever being specific. The program worked with children connected to military families, teaching them survival skills and communication protocols. Not because they were being trained to fight, because the people running it believed that if communication infrastructure ever failed during a large-scale domestic emergency, civilian populations would need another layer of coordination." He stopped. The children were chosen because their parents were already inside the program, and because children retain things differently than adults. More durably, more accurately. They used us as backups, Danielle said. As living archives, Nathan said, for information that was too sensitive to put anywhere that could be hacked or burned. The police cruiser pulled up outside, lights sweeping through the blinds. Danielle squeezed her grandmother's hand once and then went to answer the door. She spent 20 minutes with the officer, a young man she knew vaguely, had seen in the diner a few times. She told him what Nathan had told her say. Break-in. 2 men. They fled. The officer took notes, looked at the broken door, looked at Ranger with the expression most people got around large dogs they weren't sure about, and said someone would follow up. He didn't ask about the transmitter. Nathan had already pocketed it. When the cruiser left, Danielle stood in the doorway and looked at the damaged frame and felt the night air come through where the door no longer sealed properly. Hale sent them, she said. Yes, which means he's not going to stop. No, Nathan said. He's not. She turned around. Marcus, if Hale's willing to break into my house, what did he do to Marcus when Marcus started asking questions? Nathan didn't answer that directly, which was an answer of its own kind. Ranger tracked a scent earlier from the gloves one of the men dropped. I want to let him follow it and see where it leads. He looked at the dog, then back at her. But I want to do it tonight before the trail goes cold. Danielle didn't hesitate. I'm coming with you. Her grandmother, who had been sitting quietly through all of it with a cup of tea she'd made for herself in the dark kitchen using only the light from her phone, looked up and said, be careful. Not don't go, or call the police, or this is too dangerous. Just be careful. Danielle had spent years wondering where she got her steadiness from. She looked at her grandmother and understood again. They left the house just after midnight. Danielle had changed into dark clothes, traded her work shoes for something better for walking. Nathan had his crutches, but moved with more speed than she'd seen from him earlier, the urgency of the situation apparently overriding some of what the injury cost him. Ranger worked the glove scent with calm efficiency, his nose moving low across the road, and then lifting to check the air, reading the night in a way that made the human world look blunt by comparison. He crossed the street, moved along the far sidewalk for half a block, then turned down a side street that led away from the residential neighborhood and toward the older part of town, the industrial stretch that had been declining since the 2 main factories closed 8 years back. It was quiet out here. Empty buildings with dark windows, a fence line with weeds growing through it. The kind of place that accumulated old things and didn't get visited often. Ranger moved without hesitation. The warehouse he stopped at was one of several that had clustered together along the old freight road. Low buildings, corrugated metal walls, loading docks now empty and rusting. He stopped at the corner of the largest one and turned his head back toward Nathan once, then back at the building. Nathan moved up beside the dog and crouched. He looked along the wall, then at the building's side windows. One window had light behind it. Not much, just the thin glow of work lights or a lantern pressing through layers of grime on the glass. Danielle came up beside him. He pointed at the window, and she nodded. He moved along the wall to it, lifted himself carefully to look through the lower corner. He looked for 5 seconds. Then he stepped back and looked at Danielle, and she read his face before he said a word. He's in there, Nathan said quietly. Danielle closed her eyes for 1 second. Then she opened them. Is he hurt? He's alive, Nathan said. He's in a chair. I couldn't tell more than that from the angle. She started toward the door, and Nathan caught her arm. There are guards. I counted 2 inside from what I could see, possibly more in the sections I couldn't. She looked at the door, then at Nathan. Get him out, she said simply. Nathan studied the building for 2 full minutes before he moved. Not stalling, reading. The way someone reads a space when the cost of misreading it is too high. He looked at the placement of the windows, the number and spacing of the loading dock doors, where the light was coming from inside versus where it was darkest. Then he looked at Ranger and made a hand signal Danielle didn't recognize. The dog moved along the wall, low and silent, toward the far end of the building. He'll take the long way around, Nathan said quietly. Create a distraction at the rear when I signal him. We go in through the side door, He pointed to a maintenance door 20 feet along the near wall, while their attention is at the back. How do you signal him from here? Nathan showed her a small transmitter clipped to his jacket. Vibration pulse. No sound. Danielle nodded. What do I do? Stay behind me until we're inside. Once we're in, stay on my left shoulder and don't move to my right. That's Ranger's side when he comes in. He looked at her. If something happens and we get separated, you go out the side door and back to the road and you call 911. You don't come back in. Understood, she said, in a way that made clear she understood and was not necessarily going to follow that instruction. Nathan didn't push it. He moved. The maintenance door was padlocked, but a padlock on an old building is only as strong as the door it's mounted to. And this door had a decade of rust and weather in its hinges. Nathan applied pressure in the right place, and the mounting plate gave way with a grinding sound that he immediately masked by pushing the door inward hard, the metallic scrape of the door itself covering the smaller noise. They were inside. The warehouse interior smelled like old concrete and something chemical, oil or solvent, something industrial. The work lights Nathan had seen from the window were two portable LED lanterns set on the floor, casting hard shadows across a large open space that had probably once held inventory or equipment, and now held almost nothing. Almost nothing except for the men and the chair in the center of the space. Marcus was in the chair. Danielle saw him from across the warehouse floor and felt something move through her that wasn't quite relief yet. Not until she saw his chest rise and fall. He was upright, arms bound behind him, his head down. He looked like a man who had been in that chair for a long time. Two guards stood at opposite ends of the room. Neither was looking toward the maintenance door. One was near the main loading dock door at the far end, checking his phone. The other was closer, maybe 40 feet from where Danielle and Nathan had entered, leaning against a support beam with his back to them. Nathan put his hand out flat. Stop. Danielle froze. Nathan watched the closer guards breathing, waited for the head to turn away, then pressed the signal on the transmitter. 3 seconds passed. The rear wall of the warehouse erupted in sound. A tremendous metallic crash, the sound of something large going over, and both guards spun toward the back of the building. Nathan moved on the closer guard before the man's attention had fully committed to the noise. He was fast and quiet and controlled, and within seconds the guard was on the floor with a professionalism that Danielle didn't examine too closely. She was already moving toward Marcus. She put her hand on his face first. Marcus, it's me. It's Danielle. I'm here. And he lifted his head and she saw his eyes come into focus, and she let herself feel the relief for exactly 1 second. Can you stand? She said. Yeah, he said, the word coming out rough. Yeah, I think so. She worked a knot on the rope at his wrists. Simple knot. Someone had tied it in a hurry, and freed his hands. He brought them forward and winced at the movement. The second guard had moved toward the source of the crash at the back of the building, but he hadn't disappeared. He was coming back now, having found a knocked-over shelving unit and nothing else. No intruder, no explanation. His flashlight swept the space. Danielle crouched low, pulling Marcus down with her. Nathan had moved to the edge of the light, watching the second guard's flashlight track across the floor. Then Ranger appeared from the shadows at the guard's left side, and the handler command Danielle had performed at the diner came back to her. She saw Nathan give it with absolute precision, and Ranger moved in complete silence. The second guard was down and secured before the flashlight hit the floor. For a moment, the warehouse was quiet, except for the three of them breathing. Then Marcus grabbed Danielle's arm and said, "We have to get out. There's more coming. Hale, he's been in and out all day. He was here an hour ago. Hale did this." Nathan said, "Victor Hale, yeah." Marcus looked at the Navy SEAL with the wariness of a man who'd been grabbed once already and was reconsidering everyone. "Who are you?" "Someone on the right side of this," Danielle said. "Trust him." Marcus looked at Nathan for 2 seconds, then at Ranger, who had padded over and was sitting calmly between them all. The dog seemed to settle something for him. He exhaled. "Okay, you need to tell me what you found," Nathan said. "Quickly, while we move." They moved toward the side door, Marcus walking with a slight unsteadiness that came from too long in a chair and not enough food, probably. He talked while they moved, his voice kept low. He had started digging into their family history about 8 months ago. He'd been driven by the same thing that had always driven him: the specific blurriness of those early childhood years, the sense that memory should extend further back than it did. He found their parents' names in an old county record and ran them through every public database he could access. Hit a wall. Tried another angle: their father's service record, because their grandmother had let slip once, years ago, that their father had done something for the government before Danielle and Marcus were born. That thread led to a contract employee database that had been partially declassified. Their father's name appeared once in a single document, associated with a program designated only by a number and the word contingency. Marcus had pulled the thread further. The program had involved children. The program had been shut down after an incident. The incident had been classified. The people who ran the program had later been implicated quietly, internally, in ways that never reached prosecution, in financial crimes connected to wartime contracts. I was trying to find the documents that would tell me exactly what happened, Marcus said. They were outside now, moving along the side wall of the building in the dark. I found a reference to a physical cache, actual paper files and digital backups stored at a location connected to one of the program's field training sites. I hadn't identified the location yet when they grabbed me. A location connected to a training site, Nathan said. He was watching the road at the edge of the industrial property, checking it before they stepped into the open. The training sessions, were there any references to where they were held? Some were on base, Marcus said, but some were off-site, in civilian locations. He paused. The documents mentioned using ordinary environments as part of the training, somewhere familiar to the participants. Danielle was quiet. She was feeling the thing again, the pressure of something large and not yet fully visible pressing at the edge of her accessible memory. They crossed the open ground quickly, Nathan moving in controlled bursts despite the crutches, Ranger flanking them and monitoring the tree line. They were almost to the road when the headlights appeared. 3 vehicles. They came from 2 directions, cutting off the most obvious exit routes. They moved with the organization of people who had done this before. Victor Hale stepped out of the center vehicle. He was shorter than Danielle had expected from the way Nathan described him, compact, gray-haired, with the kind of physical stillness that meant he was comfortable having other people do his moving for him. He wore a jacket over a collared shirt, and he looked, in the cold outdoor light, like a man attending a difficult business meeting rather than whatever this was. He looked at Danielle first, then at Marcus, then at Nathan. His expression didn't change. "I had hoped," he said, in a voice that was conversational and almost pleasant, "that we might have done this differently." His men had fanned out around them. 5 that Danielle could count, probably more she couldn't. "Victor Hale," Nathan said. "Commander Cole." Hale said it with a small acknowledgement, as if they'd been colleagues. "I know your record. I know Ranger's record. I don't want any of this to be violent if it doesn't have to be." "You sent men to break into her home tonight," Nathan said. "I sent men to bring her to me." The violence was their improvisation. He looked at Danielle again. "I want to talk to you, Danielle. That's all I've ever wanted. You could have come to the diner," she said. Something almost like appreciation moved through his expression. "The diner," he said. "That's appropriate, actually." He took a few steps closer. Nathan moved slightly, but one of the armed men shifted in response, and Nathan held his position. "Your parents were brave people. I want you to understand that. They believed in what we were building. They died for it," Danielle said. "They died because of a disagreement about direction." He said it smoothly, like something he'd rehearsed in the particular way you rehearse things you need to believe. The program they were part of created something extraordinary. Children who could hold complex information in durable memory, who could carry coordinates, codes, and locations embedded in training exercises. Living backups. Your parents helped design the methodology. He paused, but they disagreed about what the information should be used for. And someone decided that disagreement was fatal, Nathan said. Hale didn't deny it. He looked at Danielle. "You were the most gifted child in the program. Everyone knew it. Your memory retention was off the charts. During the final training exercise, the instructors embedded a specific set of information, coordinates, essentially for the location of documents tied to the program's financial records. He held her gaze. We believe those coordinates are still in your memory. You were 7 years old when they were placed there, and you've never been deprogrammed. Danielle thought about the children in the circle. The instructor leaning down. Something whispered. And the documents, Marcus said, because he'd been putting it together too, expose everything you did with the program's budget, the diverted funds, the contracts. He looked at Hale with a clarity that had apparently survived 3 months of captivity. That's what this is about. There's a great deal of money attached to that information, Hale said, with the frankness of a man who'd stopped pretending, and a great deal of consequence. I'd like to find a civilized resolution. Ranger had been still throughout all of this. Now he turned his head sharply toward the warehouse. His nostrils worked. Nathan read him. He smells something, he said, almost under his breath. Danielle caught it too. Something chemical, something sharp beneath the cold air. She looked at the warehouse. Then at Hale. You wired the building, Nathan said. Insurance, Hale said, in case the documents inside were accessed before I could retrieve them. Standard precaution. He looked at Nathan calmly, which means your timeline for this conversation is somewhat compressed. Danielle felt everything in her go very quiet. She looked at Hale. She looked at the warehouse. She looked at Ranger, who was still reading the air with that particular focus. She thought about the phrase, the one that had been sitting at the edge of her recovered memory since the fight at her house, growing slowly clearer as the night went on. The key isn't a place. It's a signal. She understood what it meant now, or she thought she did. The information she'd been given as a child wasn't coordinates in the geographic sense. It was a sequence, a recognition sequence, that would allow someone to identify a physical location by reading the environment rather than following a map. Environmental memory anchors, Nathan had called it. The location was tied to a place she already knew. She looked at Hale and made a decision. I remember, she said. Nathan's head turned. Hale went very still. The cache, she said. The location. I know where it is. She held Hale's eyes. Route 9, going east out of town. There's a state forest access road about 4 miles out. There's an old pump station at the end of it that hasn't been operational in 15 years. She watched him absorb this. The documents are below the concrete floor of the equipment room on the south end. Hale studied her. Danielle kept her breathing even. And you'll take us there, he said. I'll tell you exactly how to find it, she said. That pump station, the access road, is only visible if you know the specific landmark. There's a split-rail fence post with a yellow survey marker. That's the turn. From there, it's a 1/4 mile. Hale was already on his radio, speaking quietly. Danielle watched him and didn't let anything show on her face. Nathan was watching her too, and she could feel the question in his gaze. The very careful, controlled question of a man who wasn't sure what she was doing and was trusting her no. While Hale's attention was on his radio, Nathan shifted. Subtle, almost invisible. He had moved to a position where Ranger was on his right, near the warehouse wall, and the dog's head was still turned toward the building's far corner. Nathan moved his hand. Ranger slipped around the corner of the warehouse. 2 minutes passed. Hale finished his instructions and looked back at Danielle with the satisfied expression of a man who thought he had won. We'll verify your information, he said. If it checks out, a distant sound from the far side of the warehouse. A single sharp crack, then silence. Hale från it. One of his men moved toward it. Nathan triggered the transmitter. What followed happened in segments that Danielle processed unevenly. The controlled explosion Nathan had somehow managed in those 2 minutes, small, targeted at the rear corner of the building where the wiring must have been heaviest, the flash and sound forcing Hale's men to scatter. Nathan moving into the nearest of them with the efficiency she'd seen in her house, compressed and precise. Ranger returning from the far side and removing the man closest to Danielle before she'd registered he was. There, Marcus grabbing her hand. And then they were running. Into the dark, away from the vehicles, into the overgrown strip between the warehouse road and the back residential streets. Hale's voice behind them, angry for the first time. Orders being given. Car doors. They ran. The pump station on Route 9 didn't exist. The survey marker was something she'd invented from a memory of ordinary fences. The entire thing had been constructed in 30 seconds in the back of her mind while she watched Hale's expression and measured how badly he needed to believe. She bought them time. Whether it was enough was still an open question. Behind her, the warehouse let out a second sound. Larger this time, the demolition charge Hale had primed going up on whatever delayed mechanism it had been set to. The sky behind them lit orange, and the heat washed forward, and Marcus made a sound, and Danielle pulled him, and they kept moving until the sound was behind them and the residential streets were ahead. She thought about what Hale had said about the cache, about the location she actually remembered, the one she hadn't spoken. It was real, and it wasn't on Route 9. She knew where it was. She'd known since the moment Ranger had walked directly to that booth in the diner, and she had looked under the seat. The three of them moved through back streets until the warehouse glow behind them faded, and the only light was the ordinary kind, porch lamps and street lights, and the occasional blue flicker of a television through a curtain. Marcus was steadier on his feet now, the movement helping, though he still leaned slightly toward Danielle when the sidewalk was uneven. Ranger walked point the whole way, monitoring ahead and behind in steady alternation, as calm as if this were a routine evening. Nathan watched the dog and trusted the dog, which was the only reason he allowed himself to speak rather than stay completely silent while they moved. "Route 9, he said quietly. "The pump station." "That was false." "All of it," Danielle said. "He'll figure it out inside an hour." "I know." She kept walking. "We don't need an hour." Nathan looked at her sideways. "You already know the real location." She didn't answer immediately. She was thinking about how to explain something that she herself had only fully understood in the last 20 minutes. The way a thing can sit inside you for decades, patient and dormant, and then surface all at once when the right combination of circumstances brings it forward. "The diner," she said. Marcus looked at her sharply. "Harper's Diner," she said. The training sessions used ordinary places as anchor points, places the children would return to naturally over time, so the memory association stayed active. She paused. "I've been working in that diner for 4 years, and I never once wondered why it felt like somewhere I already knew the first time I walked in." She shook her head slowly. It wasn't coincidence. Nothing about any of this was coincidence. Nathan was quiet for a moment. "Then the booth, where I sat this morning." Ranger walked straight to it, Danielle said. "Not because of you, because of what's underneath it." They reached the diner from the alley side, coming up along the back of the building where the kitchen delivery door sat padlocked and dark. The diner had been closed for 3 hours. The parking lot out front was empty. The Route 9 sign was visible from where they stood, the missing letters still missing, the whole structure just as indifferent to the night as it was to every morning. Nathan worked the delivery door lock in the dark efficiently, and then they were inside. The kitchen was strange in the dark. All those familiar surfaces turned into shapes and edges, and the lingering smell of coffee grounds and dish soap. Danielle moved through it without hesitation because she knew every inch of it, knew where the floor dipped near the prep station and where the overhead rack hung low enough to catch you if you weren't paying attention. She pushed through the swing door into the dining room. The diner at night was quieter than she'd ever heard it. No coffee machine running, no low conversation, no Earl at the counter. Just the orange glow of the exit sign above the front door and the thin light coming through the front windows from the street. Ranger moved past her immediately, purposeful, crossing the room without hesitation. He stopped at the booth. The same booth. Nathan's booth from that morning, the one nearest the east window, with the torn vinyl seat and the wobble in the table that Danielle had been meaning to report to the manager for 2 months. He sat down beside it and looked at Danielle. She slid into the booth from the opposite side and reached under the seat, not randomly, but with the specific certainty of someone whose hand remembered the motion even if her mind had not. Her fingers found the edge of something solid beneath the seat frame, set back against the wall support, invisible unless you were looking for it and knew where to look. A metal container, small, the size of a hardback book, sealed with a simple latch that had been painted over at some point and then scraped clean again recently. Like someone had accessed it not too long ago, or prepared for access. She sat on the table. The three of them looked at it for a moment. Marcus reached across and opened the latch. Inside, 2 flash drives in sealed plastic sleeves, and a folded set of documents printed on paper that had yellowed slightly at the edges but was still fully legible. Danielle unfolded the top sheet and angled it toward the exit sign's light. The header read, Contingency Program, Financial Oversight Review, Classified. The pages beneath it were dense with names, dates, transaction records, and transfer amounts that ran into the millions. Danielle couldn't absorb all of it in the dim light, but certain names surfaced clearly: contractors, military liaisons, a sequence of shell accounts. And Victor Hale's name, appearing across multiple transactions spanning more than a decade, each one tied to diverted wartime funds. At the bottom of the document stack was a single page with a different header. It was an internal memorandum dated 15 years ago, and it documented a decision. The decision was about her parents. The memorandum described them as a liability. It used bureaucratic language to say it, terms like program security, concern, and voluntary separation, but the meaning underneath the language was not bureaucratic at all. It was a directive, and the signature at the bottom was Victor Hale's. Danielle read it twice. Then she set it face down on the table and put both her hands flat on the surface and breathed. Marcus put his hand over hers. Nathan was watching the front windows. "He's going to come here," Nathan said. "When Route 9 turns up empty, this is the next logical target. He knows the diner is connected to the program." "How long do we have?" Marcus asked. "Not long." Nathan already had his phone out. He wasn't calling the police. Not yet. Not the local department, who would arrive slowly and without context. He scrolled to a number, pressed call, and when the line picked up, he spoke quietly and quickly. A name Danielle didn't recognize. A federal contact she gathered from the clipped and specific way Nathan delivered information to him. He read out the program designation. He used Hale's full name. He mentioned the documents. Then he said, "I'm sending you everything right now. Both files, full document scan. Do not wait for my follow-up before acting on this." He hung up and looked at Danielle. "Give me one of the drives." She handed it across. Nathan connected it to his phone with a small adapter from his jacket pocket. The kind of preparation that spoke to a man who had anticipated this moment or something like it. And she watched the transfer indicator run while Ranger stayed focused on the front of the building. Then the headlights appeared outside. 2 vehicles this time, not 3. Hale had lost men tonight, and his patience had run out along with them. He came through the front door of the diner the same way his men had come through her front door hours before. Not knocking, not waiting, just entering as if the space already belonged to him. He saw them immediately. The container on the table. The documents. Nathan with his phone. His expression, for the first time all night, was not composed. "The drive," he said. He had one man with him. One visible man positioned at the door. Whatever force he deployed earlier in the evening had been reduced to this. The night had cost him. Nathan set the phone on the table face up and said, "Already sent." Hale looked at the phone, at the completed transfer notification on the screen. Something moved through his face that wasn't quite emotion, more like the internal experience of a structure collapsing. "To whom?" he said. "Federal contacts and an investigative journalist who's been looking at wartime contractor fraud for 3 years, Nathan said. "She's been waiting for a source like this. I'd imagine she'll have the first piece published before morning." Hale stood very still. Then he moved toward Danielle. He wasn't reaching for the documents. He was reaching for her. The motion of a man who had run out of leverage and was attempting to manufacture some from whatever he could grab. It was a desperate move, and they all saw it coming, and Ranger saw it first. The dog was across the table length before Hale's hand closed on anything. He took Hale cleanly and completely, driving him back against the counter stools, and the one-armed man at the door raised his weapon, and Nathan moved. 2 steps, the same compact precision she'd seen at the house. And the weapon was redirected, and Nathan's elbow found the man's jaw, and the man sat down hard among the overturned stools. Hale was on the floor with Ranger above him, and he was not moving, and the dog was completely controlled. Not savage, not frantic, just absolutely, immovably in command of the situation. A professional to the end. "Ranger," Nathan said calmly. The dog held position, watching Hale with those steady gold-brown eyes. From outside came the sound that Danielle had been waiting for without quite letting herself expect it. Multiple vehicles, moving fast. Blue and red light strobing through the front windows of the diner, painting everything in alternating color. The sound of radios and doors and footsteps. Nathan had made more than one call that evening. The federal contact was one. The message sent earlier to a field agent he trusted before the warehouse, before any of this came to its end, that had been the other. The second call at the diner had been the confirmation. The front door opened again, and this time it was different kinds of people. Hale was on his feet and in handcuffs before Danielle fully registered the transition from chaos to order. The man at the door was taken out. 2 federal agents moved through the diner with the efficiency of people who had been briefed and knew exactly what they were looking for. One of them picked up the documents from the table, looked at the header, and looked at Nathan. "This the contingency material?" "That and more," Nathan said. The agent nodded and handled the documents with the seriousness they deserved. Danielle watched Victor Hale being walked past her toward the door. He turned his head and looked at her as he passed. Not with anger, exactly. More with the expression of a man trying to understand what he had miscalculated and landing on the wrong answer, as he probably always had. She didn't say anything to him. There wasn't anything to say. Marcus came and stood beside her, and they watched Hale walk out through the front door of Harper's Diner into the red and blue light, and neither of them said a word for a long moment. Then Marcus exhaled. A long, slow release. 3 months of captivity and fear and uncertainty coming out in a single breath. "Mom and Dad," he said. "I know," Danielle said. "They were trying to stop him." "I know." She picked up the memorandum from the table, the one with the signature at the bottom, and looked at it one more time. Then she handed it to the federal agent who was cataloging the container's contents. It belonged in official hands. It always had. Her parents had tried to put it there and hadn't been allowed to, but the thing about evidence is that it waits. It sat under a diner booth for 15 years and waited for the right night. Nathan was speaking with the lead agent near the window. Ranger sat beside Nathan's left leg, watching the room come to order, entirely relaxed now that the work was done. One of the younger officers made the mistake most people made, reaching toward the dog without asking, and Nathan said, "Hand out, palm up," without looking, and the officer adjusted, and Ranger sniffed his hand and accepted the attention calmly. The diner looked the same as it always did. Counter, stools, the wobble table, the booth with the hidden compartment now open and empty. The exit sign still glowing. The coffee machine still cold and dark. In 3 hours, the morning staff would come in and turn the lights on and start the first pot, and the regulars would arrive and take their seats. Earl would knock twice. The Hendersons would ask for Danielle on Sunday, except Danielle wouldn't be there. She understood that now, standing in the middle of it, not as a sad thing, the way she might have expected it to feel. She had given this place 4 years, and her mornings and her best effort, and there was nothing wrong with that. But the person who had walked in through the kitchen door at 5:30 every morning because she needed the paycheck and the insurance had been living on the surface of something much larger, and now the surface had cracked open entirely. She thought about her parents, about 2 people who had believed in something and had tried to protect it and had been silenced for trying. She thought about the files now in federal hands, their work, their evidence, their attempt at accountability finally arriving where they had always meant it to go. She thought about what she wanted to do next. One of the federal agents had given her a card. He'd said, with the careful phrasing of a person trained to be careful, that her familiarity with the program's materials and methodology would be valuable to an ongoing investigation into contractor fraud cases that connected to this one. He said other survivors of the program had been located over the years. He said the kind of environmental memory work that had preserved these documents might apply in other cases. She'd put the card in her pocket and not said yes or no. Not yet. That night, Danielle sat with her grandmother in the kitchen and told her most of it. The old woman listened the way she always had, without rushing, without interrupting, letting the information arrive at its own pace. When Danielle finished, her grandmother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your mama always said the truth was patient." She was right, Danielle said. Her grandmother nodded once. She usually was. The weeks that followed moved differently than the weeks before. Hale's arrest became news and then became a larger story, the kind that accumulated detail as other people came forward. The journalist Nathan had published the first piece within 36 hours, and then 3 more pieces over the following weeks as the documents were authenticated and the scope of the financial crimes became clear. The names attached to the program expanded. The accountability expanded with them. Danielle cooperated with the federal investigation, and then, after a conversation with the case agent that ran for 2 hours and ended with her asking better questions than he'd expected, she accepted a consultant role helping locate similar material in other dormant cases connected to the program's network. It turned out her particular form of memory, the one the instructors had developed in that cold room when she was 7 years old, was not uniquely hers. There were others. Finding them took patience and a specific kind of trust. She was good at both. Marcus, who had spent 3 months in a warehouse and emerged with his curiosity intact, finished what he'd started. The research he'd begun into their family history now had answers to fill its gaps. He wrote it all down, not for publication, just for them. 43 pages that began with their parents' names and ended with the diner. Nathan stopped in 6 weeks after that final night, pulling into the Harper's lot on a Tuesday morning with Ranger in the back of the truck. He found Danielle there. She'd agreed to cover 2 weeks while the diner found a replacement, and the 2 weeks had stretched into 5 because that was the kind of person she was. She brought him coffee without being asked. Ranger walked to the booth by the east window and sat beside it. Nathan watched the dog settle, that familiar posture, and felt the same thing he'd felt on that first morning. The certainty of a well-trained animal that had recognized something no human in the room had understood yet. He picked up his mug. "How are you?" "Better than I was," Danielle said. "You?" "The leg's coming along." She looked at Ranger, calm and settled in his spot by the booth, watching the room with those gold-brown eyes. She thought about a Thursday morning and a question across a nearly full diner and a dog who decided, for reasons only he fully understood, that she was someone worth staying beside. "Good thing you trusted your dog that day," she said. Nathan set down the mug. Outside, the morning regulars were pulling in, trucks in the gravel, headlights cutting across the lot, the whole familiar rhythm of it. "Ranger didn't just recognize you," he said quietly. He looked at her across the table, and she held his gaze, and the dog between them stayed exactly where he was. He recognized a hero. If the truth about who you really are was hidden from you your entire life, would you have the courage to claim it, or would you leave it buried? If this story moved you, like and subscribe. We have more stories that will stay with you long after they end.